Have you been thinking about making quilts? Does it appeal to your creative side? But is the cost of everything that you need putting you off? If it is, you might be interested to watch this video. Hello again, my name's Diane and I design and make patchwork quilts. And this video is a little bit different from my usual content. In this video, I thought I'd show you how I can make beautiful quilts on a very tight budget. I'd like to share with you a few ways that you can make a quilt, something beautiful, that doesn't cost the earth. So if you're interested in that, please continue watching. Let's start with the machine. It is the most basic of basics. I have just completed making a quilt and so I'm giving it a good clean. I'm going to change the needle and I'm just getting into all the nooks and crannies where I can. And the oil I use is made for sewing machines. So basically what I'm trying to do, I've removed all the lint and then anything that moves and you can see a joint, and I shall put a tiny little bit of oil on, and it is a tiny little bit. Less is more in this instance. And I buy Schmetz universal needles for the machine. They last the longest and they're strong, so I don't cut corners there. And I have got a walking foot that I use for the quilting. It came from the Singer outlet. I'm not on commission or anything like that, sponsored from Singer. And there we go, the machine is all clean and it's under its dust cover. It's a little homemade thing, just made with scraps of fabric that were left over from other projects. To be honest, it very rarely lives under this cover because it's always in use. But while I'm cleaning today, it's all tucked away. And in my bid to be eco-friendly, I try and utilise everything I have. So before I go and buy anything, I see if there's anything lying around that I can use. And so I keep all of my mechanical bits and bobs in this Quality Street tin. Now this is a very old tin. It's my late mother's. And that does the job perfectly well. And she used to keep bandages in that. As ladies of her generation did. I'm not sure whether it was because her children were particularly prone to accidents, but we always had a good supply of bandages in this tin, and now I use it for my sewing machine parts. Okay, that's the machine covered, so let's have a look now at the thread. This is the box where I keep all of my threads. Again, it's repurposed. It was a very small fishing tackle box that my son had when he was a small boy. I'll show you what's in there. So inside I have the ends of reels of cotton. I use Coats and Moon 120. It's a basic polyester. It's perfectly adequate for a basic machine like that. The more sensitive sewing machine you have, the more sensitive it is to lint on cottons. But these work perfectly well as long as you clean your machine regularly. And in this top I have some bobbins and a few little notions, and then below that is my thread. So I have a good store of black and white, I have cream, I have various greys and a few odd colours, and there is some Gutterman thread in here for when I've done something that I wanted a finer thread for, but for most purposes this is adequate. So basic thread on a basic machine. Now let's have a look at the basic cutting tools I use. So I have a simple cutting mat which is 11 inches by 17. It's beginning to show its age now. It will be needing to be replaced quite soon. And I have a Friscar's rotary cutter, which again is quite old now. And during lockdown, when I couldn't get the blades for the Friscar's, I bought a box of these titanium blades. And to be honest, I still got some left. They've been perfectly fine. So normally I would recommend only using the Friscar blades, but these have been okay. And I do have some other scissors, but these are the scissors that I use mainly. I use a pair of snips, these small ones and this larger one, and that's all I use. Let me show you these snips. So talking about repurposing, I'd like to show you these snips. As you can see, it's just in I don't know what it is, some sort of masking tape, decorator's tape with a bit of cardboard inside. So the sleeve has been made by my grandmother. That's who these belong to. When she died and we sorted out her belongings, I wanted to keep these, nobody else did. And they're a basic spring hinge that just come up and down. And these must be 60 years old. But they're still really sharp and I use them all the time. So there we go, repurposing heirlooms. Precious to me, nobody else. And then we move on to the notions, and that is a very deep rabbit hole to fall into if you're not careful. There are so many lovely shaped notions out there, but I use these three. So the first one is this, it's 6.5 inches wide by 24 inches long. So that's my largest one, and I use that to cut all of my 4 3/4 inches and my 3-inch strips. This one is 2.5 inches wide by 17 inches long. And then this old faithful thing is a ruler, metal ruler with a rubber strip down the back. That's 12 inches long and it's 1 3/8 wide. And I use this for my log cabins because I love that size that it gives me. So those are all the tools I use for cutting with. So that's practically everything. I do have some straight pins, a little seam ripper, and a box with a repurposed tin for my wonder clips. And those are it, I think. Can't think of anything else. So we have everything we need now to make our quilt apart from the fabric. And that's where the danger can lie. That can become a really expensive hobby. There's so many beautiful fabrics out there. But really, how much fabric do you need? Are you going to be able to make quilts that will use that fabric? So think about what you're buying to start with. Ask at the quilt shop what's the least they'll be willing to sell you. So think about, if you want to have a scrappy quilt, how much do you need to buy to start with? You don't need to buy a yard or half a yard, a quarter of a yard. Buy the least that they're willing to sell. Fat quarters are another good option, but also you've got ends of bolts, the bargain bins, because you'll want to make a basic quilt, a utilitarian quilt. The quilt we're going to make isn't a show quilt or an art quilt. It's a quilt to be loved by the family. It's to be slept on by the children and the dogs. It's for a picnic, it's for a beach, it's to throw on the sofa or the bed, it's in and out of the washing machine. It's not a precious thing that can't be touched. You haven't got these do not touch labels on our basic quilts. In fact, you should have a please touch, please cuddle on our quilts. What do you do with the fabric that you have left over? Once you've finished a project, there's always amounts left over, and when you get to know the sort of quilts you like to make, then you can think about the sort of fabric sizes you want to cut your leftovers into. So our aim is to get the most that we can possibly get from our fabric that we've bought. And so the smallest sizes I'll keep are 1 3/8, which is the width of this ruler squared, and that makes the perfect size for the start of a log cabin. And you can even fussy cut little centerpieces. So I love log cabins and I really like the size that I get from this. So that's the smallest I'll save. And in this box I keep all my fabric strips. So let's have a closer look inside. I have A4 plastic wallets that I've repurposed, and inside are all the 1 3/8 strips, all different lengths, all different colours. I've colour coordinated them into different bags, and there's a piece of black card to give it a little bit of body. And so all of these just lay on their side, and then when I'm ready to do my next log cabin quilt, have all the strips ready cut. And I store my leftover 2.5 inch strips in exactly the same way. So after I've finished a project, I tidy up, cut the strips, and then put them all in their folders. And then when I want to have a look inside to see what I've got, what I can make, it's a matter of just simply running my fingers across and it's all to see. Works for me. It's a simple system. And there is a delicate balancing act because you want to have a variety of materials to make your quilts interesting, but then you don't want to be overwhelmed by massive storage. So I keep most of my fabrics in this cupboard. So on the bottom right is leftover batting from quilts that I've made, and something I found quite early on is I always buy more batting than I need for a project. Now that sounds counterintuitive when I'm saying don't buy things just to create a hoard, but if you buy the next size up of the batting that you need and then cut off the surplus, the difference in the cost is only usually a couple of pounds, and you get quite a lot of fabric left over which you can then sew together to make another quilt. So that is something I do tend to buy more of. And the batting that I've bought that is too narrow to be sewn together, I cut up into small portions and then I turn it into a cushion. And it's always 100% cotton batting inside, so they're quite heavy, they're quite robust, nice cushions, especially for in the garden. There are some odds and ends of things, but it's these 3 boxes here, these 3 that we'll look at next. And so in this box I store fabric that is larger than a fat quarter. And what I tend to do is before I start another project, I look at this fabric and think, is there anything here that inspires me to design another quilt? So usually I start with this and then build around it. And in this box I have my fat quarters. So again, there's not a vast amount there, but there's a good variation now. And then the last box in that cupboard contains my 4 3/4 inch squares. So all of those little bits and bobs there will probably be a half square triangle in the not too distant future. And then whenever I've made a project and I've got half square triangles in the quilt, there's usually some left over and I keep those in this box here. So we have a coloured side with a white or a cream, and then we have again colour with a black, and then we have some black and white, and then we've got some miscellaneous shapes, but there are still 3 inches, and then we have all colour, and again some miscellaneous ones, and then one day they might go into a scrappy quilt. And this is the last box. So in here I have 2.5 inch squares, another one of these A4 wallets, so 2.5 inch squares are in there, and then this one is smaller than 3 inch half square triangles, and then this one is 3 inch squares but with perhaps a young person's design, and then this is all 3 inch squares, again sort of set by colour. Now let's get on to the backing of the quilt. This can be another big expense, and I think this is one of the reasons why such a lot of quilt makers have flimsies in cupboards and they don't get around to finishing quilts. But there are ways that you can make it a little bit cheaper. And so of course you want the backing to be robust, it's got to be fit for purpose. And I think of my quilts as going in and out of a washing machine, but I make the backs in a variety of ways, always using 100% cotton. And so in this one I've used scraps of fabric that I've put into blocks, and then I've just extended that with a cheaper cotton to go around the outside, so that works perfectly fine. And in my bee quilt there was some fabric that I thought was a little bit wishy-washy, but it goes perfectly well with the front because it's all bee themed, and in the back it's 100% cotton and it works lovely. So again, just extended it out with some cheaper cotton, and that makes a nice backing. And on the back of this mermaid quilt there was some fabric here, this lovely octopus, and you can just see there's a white piece there. It's where the ink or the print hasn't penetrated the fabric through. There was probably a thread or something there in the printing process, but there's no hole in the quilt, so it's perfectly fine. So I've bordered that. I wouldn't have used this on the front because of that flaw, but it's perfectly fine to use on the back. And then I've bordered that in a green to tie in with the front. And then this is Egyptian cotton. It was a duvet, it was new, I bought it new, a bargain price. I pre-washed it and I've used that now, And that is one of my go-to methods when I'm backing a quilt, because this fabric is really nice quality and it's a lot cheaper than if you're going out and you're buying quilting cotton. So that's something else to bear in mind when you're backing the quilt. So that's it, the definitive guide to how I make my quilts on a budget. So I hope you found some of that useful. There's some things in there I wish I'd have known earlier when I first started making quilts. Primarily I make quilts for myself, for my friends, for my family, and sometimes I sell them in an Etsy shop, but that's a whole nother story, and perhaps one day I'll make a video on that if you're interested, how and why that came about. But that's it really. Thanks very much for sharing your time with me and sticking to the end. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.